Hello, my loves. Welcome to another episode of Love and Lattes. Victoria, the self-love scientist here. And today I have an amazing guest here. I have the presence of Cecilia. Cecilia here is a mind and body coach with over 10 years of experience in movement training and behavioral change management. She has worked with several nonprofit organizations, schools, healthcare clinics, and yoga studios. Cecilia has helped thousands of clients lose weight, recover from loss and addictions, rediscover their strength, stop disease progression, upgrade their relationships, and regain confidence. Her programs focus on cultivating one's own intuition, taking a minimalist approach to creating a healthier lifestyle through micro adjustments. Cecilia, welcome to Love and Lattes.
Thank you, Victoria. It's so good to be here. I'm so excited for this conversation today.
Me too. We were hyping up before we hit record. I was like, oh, we should hit record. We should just do it now.
Yeah, such good energy right now.
Thank you. So I kind of want to get into some of the work you're doing, like especially with the words micro adjustments and cultivating one's own intuition. Where would you say people are struggling the most when it comes to working and connecting more with their intuition? Where do you think they're finding most blocks?
That's a really great question. I think in our society, it's really easy to get distracted and disconnected from our own, not just our own voice, but our own impressions that we take from situations and environments. The intuition is such a subtle and sometimes fragile energy to work with, that it can easily be overcome by loudness, distraction, busyness. So when it comes to cultivating intuition, I think it's really important for people to recognize dedicated time to reducing those distractions and reducing the noise around them to really tap in. Intuition is born in the silence and in the dark. It's in those quiet meditative moments when you're connecting with yourself, your own feelings and body, and also to your higher power. And that connection kind of works like a battery, right? And so once we tap into that higher brain function and that higher self, that makes it a lot easier for us to connect into the collective energies, the higher power, and really receive those messages on where we need to be going, what our next step should be. And it often is step by step when it comes to intuition. You're not necessarily going to see the whole play all at the same time. You're just going to see the next play.
I love everything you just said about that. And the fact that it is strengthened in the dark and in the silence is probably one of the most profound things I've ever heard. And you're completely right.
Thank you. I do think silence is overrated in our society, 100%.
Oh, absolutely. It's
underrated.
Yeah, everything is so go, go, go. And then the concept of trying to slow down is just, I would say in most instances, it's almost frowned upon. And because we take that to heart of the way we exert ourselves is connected to some feeling of value, which isn't actually true. Like no matter how much work you're putting out, you're just as valuable as someone who's putting out half the work. Would you agree?
I agree with that 100%. And you're right. There is a heavy focus in the society on that masculine element of taking action, which is super important. But the equal and opposite importance of that is the feminine aspect, which is the receiving mode, the meditative mode. That's when we put ourselves in a position to really receive and quiet our minds, to let our mind wander. And that can be where the most creative ideas come from. So if you're always taking action, and never sitting back to review that information, then you might find yourself in a situation or a place you don't necessarily feel like is in alignment with your best interest.
That's perfect. I'm going to take some notes. Everyone take notes. These are already gold. And when for some people who may not be as familiar or they've heard the word intuition, I think it might get kind of mixed up with this like the gut instinct, and people say listen to your gut, and then others say listen to your heart, and then there's also listen to your mind, which we tend to be like stuck in a lot. So how would you go about helping someone understand like what that is, or like the connection there? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I think that's a really amazing angle to take away from that is, or to dive into. The gut feeling is definitely something that's very different than a heart. And that's definitely very different from our logical mind. And the intuition, I think, is something that brings all of that together, right? We can have a very visceral reaction in our gut. And that might be something more immediate in our environment that's telling us this isn't the best place for us to be, right? Or opposite, it feels warm and cozy and it feels like a good direction to go in. Same thing with the heart pull. That's a whole different energy of this is where I feel like my heart is opening and this is what I want to open towards. However, those also can be influenced by outside energies, outside circumstances. And so I think, for me at least, my understanding is that the intuition is going to be a more refined gut feeling and heart pull. It's kind of both of those things, but putting it through almost a refinement process of, is this coming from my ego? Which is a really important first question to ask ourselves before we take a step. Is this coming from my ego and something I just desire out of some lower chakra need or some lower vibrational need? Or is this something that I'm really being called to do on a higher level that's going to advance me, whether that be spiritually, physically, mentally, emotionally, what have you. So I think of the intuition like a refinement mill for those kinds of nudges that we get.
I'm glad you mentioned the different factors that can impact like decision making, including the gut. And I feel like it is influenced by previous experiences, who you're surrounding yourself with, the food you're eating. And that's kind of like why you said, it gets stronger when you start toning those things out.
Yeah, I agree. It is. It's very much something that you want to take away those distractions and check in with where it's coming from. And I'm really glad you mentioned food too, because food is something that matters a lot, not just from an obvious nutrition standpoint and what's best for the physical body, but what a lot of people don't realize, particularly if they have low digestion or digestive disorders like Crohn's disease, it's very difficult to tap into the true, authentic feelings of your gut if it's constantly in pain, if it is inconsistent in its messages. And also, like you said, the previous experiences, that those trauma responses can often feel like intuition. And that's another good filter that we need to process our information through as well, through the intuition is this coming from a past experience? Am I projecting my past into my present and my future?
And I never would have considered trauma impacting something on the gut, but I do know that certain emotions or like just those experiences in general can hold a place right like below the navel. And that's where we do see like the whole idea of like, dis-ease, and you break it into two separate words, is just the state of being uneasy from, the messages we're sending to our body. Like everything you're feeling is being processed, down to a cell into your body. So like if you have stomach aches or inflammation, like even if you're, it's how do you feel when you're putting food in your mouth, or the company you're keeping when you're enjoying it. It's wild.
Yeah. The body is an amazing machine, an amazing invention, a creation that is just so subtle and so layered, and it really does impact us, the people that we're around, and that's another good thing to kind of sit down and look at when you are going through like, oh, I want to become more intuitive in my life so that I feel less indecisive. Indecision is one of the biggest indicators that someone is disconnected from their intuition. When you're tapped into your intuition, you have a good relationship with your higher power, it it doesn't eliminate indecision, but it does speed it up if you're more tuned in, I'll say that.
And when you say tuned in, that's probably, are you saying like maybe you have a more confident approach to your decision making? Like you like have a well-developed system like of trust?
Yeah, I think that it comes from having a solid practice with developing the intuition. I think that that confidence and decisiveness comes from knowing that you're so strong in that practice of whatever it is for you, whether it is connecting to God, whether it's connecting to your ancestors or your higher self, right? I think all of those things have the same effect in terms of clarifying for you and trusting. And there's also little tests you can do along the way, like skill builders and things like this that you can practice. Like for instance, if you have a meditation practice, you can introduce lots of different tools, like breathing or sensory deprivation. That's a good one. And I think that once you know, you'll know, and it'll just come easier and easier when something pops up to check in. And now you can check in with your gut because you're a little more confident that the messages you're getting are clear, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think the confidence is also coming from, just that sense of well-being. And I think, I know we've been talking a lot about the gut, and what I definitely want to get into also is something that I notice in my own practices is when people feel stuck or stagnant in like their personal relationships, then it's because they have a block in their, which is considered the sacral region. So for anyone who's curious, this is more like right around the pelvis area. It's covering all of your sexual organs. And this is a place where like creativity is generally, this is where creativity is, because technically for anyone who is a woman and a woman with these sex organs, technically that's where children can be birthed. But instead of just birthing children, we can birth businesses, we can birth titles and just industries. And that's something I want to get into with you, because I know, Cecilia, this is your jam.
It definitely is. I think it is one of the more underrated things to look at in healthcare. And something that I'm really excited to see the Western world getting back into, at least starting to integrate the Eastern philosophies and the more ancient philosophies of where disease actually comes from. And I think it's really important to note that in this kind of exploring that we're doing of non-physical experiences that we're having as humans that impact us physically, it's really important to understand that our spiritual body is also built with particular centers, particularly energy centers, gateways, whatever you want to call them, that I believe that creation has designed for a very specific purpose. And I think that that's been reiterated by scientific studies, by cultures all around the world that do integrate our energy centers. And so sometimes I do think people can get a little bit turned off by that, or kind of dismiss it as not real because they can't touch it, but you can feel it. And I think that, if nothing else, is valid. So yeah, when you're talking about like blockages and relationships and gut feelings and how that ties together, because they're very closely tied together, right? They occupy a very similar physical space, and they also feed into each other. So when it comes to the sacral chakra, I think that the ways that can show up for people being out of balance would be not being able to make decisions in relationships, being afraid to get into relationships. I also think that it shows up a lot in creativity. I'm really glad you said that. And I'm really glad you said that the sacral energy space, particularly in a woman, is not just for birthing babies, but it is for birthing businesses, kingdoms, titles, industries, ideas, things that are going to move humanity forward. And I think that the intuition and the sacral chakra are very closely aligned and very similar in how subtle they are. So things like not feeling like you have a lot of life force, right? Because even though life force tends to be connected to the solar plexus, I think that starts in the sacral region where, you have your root chakra, and that feeds our primal needs. We are alive, we are breathing, we are feeding ourselves. And next is, how do we interact with the world around us? It's about relationships, but not just about relationships with other humans. It's about our relationship with everything, with our environment, with animals, with strangers, with ideas. And so the idea of having a relationship with an idea is a little bit different than having an issue around a relationship with a human being or just that idea in general, right? So I think if we break it down to the components and we look at the sacral energy, it is very much unique to me in that I feel like that has more masculine energy and feminine energy in the same chakral system, where I think some of the others are a little more leaning one way or the other. That's just my impression and my experience with it. But yeah, I would say that some of the blocks that show up would definitely be in your relationships, creatively feeling blocked, and just a general sense of lack of inspiration, because I think that is the first spark of inspiration that we generally feel.
Yeah.
One of the other things I love about the sacral chakra is that it's attached to our hips. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really interesting that in somatic trauma healing, the hips are often a very big focal point. You can have trauma anywhere in the body. You know this, right? But the psoas muscle particularly is known to be where we house most of our trauma. And so moving through hip exercises, hip mobility, dancing, anything that brings movement to that area, even in a non-sexual way, and I would say sometimes especially in a non-sexual way, because my impression of where we are right now collectively is the use of the sacral chakra energy, particularly for intimacy with a partner, right? And I think that hyper focusing in that one direction is doing us a disservice, because we're not really interacting with our body in a sensual way outside of that intimacy. And I think it's really important for us as a collective, women and men, to be comfortable having sensual experiences like dancing, like yoga, like things that do put you into your body in a very intimate way. And that can only lead to a stronger connection with yourself, and therefore stronger relationships with other people.
Absolutely. I agree. And for everyone who's been following the podcast, we had a very similar conversation about this with Alana, and I'll link that below so you guys can check it out. But you can have movements, you can have these sensual movements, you can, dance, you can leap, you can do hip openers, which are so yummy. And it doesn't have to be like directly correlated to sex. It doesn't have to be something that can come off as like you're, coming off as like the sex appealed object. It's more of like, this is doing more good for your body to open up and release anything that might be stuck from these, anything as like very small trauma impacts or environments to something even more devastating.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. Those micro traumas are, especially when I'm doing body work with people, are the things that I think get dismissed the most. One of the most dangerous terms I hear all the time is, I just keep trying to push through it, meaning the pain, right? And there are times to push through. I don't think pain is necessarily one of them. It depends on the situation, so I say that lightly. But when it comes to, feeling like you're out of balance, it's really important to step back and sit with that and see what it's trying to tell you, instead of just pushing forward and dismissing this thing that happened that didn't make you feel great. It didn't destroy you, maybe, but it did change you in some way. And it's important to let that go, kind of like, like sweeping the floor every once in a while. It's something you don't have to wait for something devastating to happen in order for it to have had an effect on your nervous system.
I hear what you're saying. I think I've heard that, I'm just kind of going with emotions, or, in quotes, it is what it is. And it's like, first of all, no, let's dismiss that concept, because There's a really great quote that's like, what you suppress comes back, or something like that. Oh my God, I can't think of it. But the idea that you're, let's say you get, triggered by something, or you start to have these feelings towards someone, or something brings up memories, and again, this is where we're feeling limited to express ourselves. And this is not just women, this is also men. Like, the fact that men feel like they're not allowed to express their vulnerabilities is tough, and it's doing more damage on their gut health and their sexual health. And that's where we're seeing like EDs, or the inability to like enjoy sex in general. So I think it's important, like, to give yourself the space to have this moment, whether you're grieving or experiencing shame, that it's better for your body to release it. Crying is a wonderful way it's your body's way of releasing these stored emotions, these stored micro aggressions.
Yeah, I think that's really, really an important point, especially when you're talking about men's health as well, because with the sacral chakra energy, obviously that's not exclusive to females, and men's emotional health and in a lot of ways sexual health has been impacted by our viewpoints of the roles that we're supposed to take, the outdated roles that we've been told we're supposed to fill. And one of the best things that I love about this generation is diving into that, and women coming up to men and being like, it is acceptable and encouraged even for you to be emotionally vulnerable, even if it's uncomfortable, like it doesn't have to be anything big you start with, but it starts with when you have a small feeling of discomfort, shame, sadness, that you take a few minutes and relieve that. I think there's a famous joke out there that there are women that'll just cry in their car for 5 minutes on their lunch break and then run right into work like nothing happened. And I think that's important, like those little 3-minute breakdowns can just keep you moving rather than suppressing it, and now it comes out in a bigger way, who knows when.
Yeah, I hear you. And also would like to, I'm really glad you said something about having your mini cry. Like, I can't tell you, when the time comes, like, you can be in a very good space and suddenly you're just overwhelmed with these emotions. And although it might be painful, or you're like, why am I suddenly crying? And it's like, nope, this needs to be addressed. Your body is currently overwhelmed, and this is its way of releasing. And I think it's, for anybody who feels like they have a lot of things feeling stuck or stagnant, it's important to give yourself this time to sit with it, to like you said in the beginning, like literally sit in the dark, not letting it consume you, but starting to create almost like a light in your own, to start creating this new glow from sitting in it. I think I would say, like, it took me a long time to finally sit in like my own shit and be like, wow, I can't keep blaming things on the outside when it's literally me that who has to have the power to change. And it just, you have to start integrating these steps to healing yourself. And I think it's a lot harder than it sounds. However, it's very much worth it.
I agree with that 1,000%. And I'll say too that you touched on it a little bit, where when we're talking about having those many cries or taking time to break down, intentional breakdowns, autistics do this all the time, where we give ourselves intentional time to burn out, to break down, because we know it's going to come inevitably, right? And so for the general population, I would suggest this is a great practice, because not only are you intentionally, whether that's at the end of the week or the beginning of the week, whenever you choose, you're taking time to sit down and acknowledge all the humanness that you're feeling. And one of the places I think that people can get stuck is wanting to intellectualize it, wanting to label it, wanting to understand it. I'm guilty of that as well. I always want to know why. But when it comes to processing emotions, I would say the best piece of advice, the best thing I've learned so far in my experience, is to just feel it. to just allow it to be. You might not know exactly why you've been triggered into grief. You might not know exactly why you've been triggered into anger. As long as you don't stay there, you're good, right? But it's just about acknowledging this is how I'm feeling right now. And I don't even necessarily need to know where it's coming from unless it's a recurring situation. So that's part of taking your power back. And you decide how you process instead of waiting for some unknown event to possibly trigger this category 5 unleashing in a potentially undesirable way.
Yeah. Giving yourself that time. And I'm really glad you said, like, you don't have to analyze this process. And I felt like I do that too. I'm like, damn, why am I crying? And I'm like, just let yourself have this moment, because we really do. Humans are really, over exerting themselves, or, if it's, I'm glad you mentioned overthinking, because again, one of those blocks, especially in like the gut or even the sacral area, when we start over analyzing any situation, like if we're meeting someone and suddenly we just go into like the what if game, versus like just learning to trust the process and learning to trust yourself, we can see a greater difference in how we're feeling. But yeah, oh my gosh, we're constantly because we want to know why. Humans are so curious. And like you said, and I'll say it too, like, I want to know what's going on. And yet when we actually give ourselves the permission to have this experience, which in some ways it might be shameful, but at the same time, it is a way of giving yourself some self-love and some self-care to like, actually, I do need to have this process. I do need to lay down and just be and just let it through.
I like that. And also with the shame, something that popped up for me is I don't want to say normalizing shame, but I do want to say that shame is okay. Feeling shame doesn't even necessarily mean that you were per se like a guilty party in a situation, right? Guilt is appropriate. Shame is prolonged guilt, right? And at least that's my interpretation of it. And so when that comes up, to me, it's telling me that person has been experiencing guilt for long enough that it has turned into internalized shame. And so really when it comes to that piece of feeling shame about shame, I think it's so important in that moment to explore where the guilt is coming from and if it's even yours, because there is such a common practice with guilt and humans where a lot of us just want to take on that guilt that may not even be ours. I mean, we're certainly culpable for what we allow into our lives and how we interact and show up in experiences. But being able to acknowledge, I feel guilty about that, or I feel shameful about that. Hey, that's beautiful. You know what that is? That's your point of power. That's your tipping point. That's when you can say, I accept this. I feel this way. How am I going to move different moving forward so I don't have to feel like this again, right? And in that, there's freedom.
Ooh, I love that. There's freedom in owning your vulnerabilities and your willingness to accept, like, just to speak it out loud. Like, I think I'm glad you mentioned the shame part, and I didn't realize that, I guess you said like shame is kind of built off of guilt, or the other way around, or something like that. And when you said like the guilt may not even be yours, so where do you think that might be coming from? Is that where like we get the outside noise, maybe like something we were influenced by at a younger age?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid point. I think some of the deeper issues that we can deal with sometimes as humans goes back as far as childhood, where, something like being scapegoated is something that can, if it's done enough, can instill a mental and emotional pattern in somebody that perpetuates a shame loop. And so now you find yourself 20 years later, 10 years later, whatever, feeling shameful about things that aren't really appropriate for you to necessarily feel shameful around. And it can kind of become its own life others. And I do think that a lot of that internalized guilt and shame can come from external sources. Sometimes I think it's a personality thing. I've noticed certain personality types tend to want to take on the burden of others naturally as a caretaking gesture, but that is damaging ultimately. And I think that recognizing exactly, is this mine, is a key point in that, and healing any kind of guilt or shame.
Oh my gosh, I could talk about this for a very long time. Like,
Yeah.
and that's really to say, for everyone who's listening, that is to say that, as human beings, it's perfectly okay to experience what, most people consider negative emotions, like the shame, the guilt, the anger. And as Cecilia said it well, it's just a matter of like, what do you do with the after part? Like, you're in complete power of, now that I've went through this process or I've had this experience, what is it exactly I need to do, or what is it my body is asking? And sometimes you'll get the answer almost immediately. Sometimes it comes you'll feel just better overall, or you'll get the clarity you need. And I think what's been really empowering to notice, not just for myself, but those around me and even my clients, is they finally get, once we get past, releasing the shame or the guilt, especially like around the gut or in the sacral area, is recognizing that once they get through it, like, to be like in full transparency, like once we're getting through our own shit, we're able to activate this higher state of confidence, so that for any situation that comes back, we're able to move through trusting more confidently and just owning up to it. You're like, you know what? I can tell, like, this doesn't feel aligned with my values. This doesn't line up with my energy. Something's off. So I'm going to have to, step away or move forward, in any kind of situation.
I agree. And I think that there is one of our biggest challenges as humans is the desire to be both socially acceptable and also happy and self-satisfied, right? And so there's this dichotomy that's always going on in everything that we do, every decision we make. And so when it comes to things like the sacral chakra and connecting that to outside experiences, it's really important to pull back and get comfortable with that. Like, get comfortable with the uncomfortable. And that sounds cliche, but on the other side of that, it's like getting through like an obstacle course or like a mud pit. Like, you've really just got to go through the mud of it and trust that on the other side, you're going to come out cleaner, smarter, stronger, with a more healed system, a more accurate system. And I love that for us. I love that the body and the energy centers are designed in such a way that if we take the right steps, there's always a way out. There's a way back to healing. There's a way back to your authenticity. And that is what the world needs more than anything in the world right now. More than love, I would dare say, is the world needs authenticity. And we cannot be authentic if we are not tapped in, tuned in to what's happening to us physically and energetically. We cannot be authentic if we are not willing and readily able to admit the negative feelings that we're feeling around something. Even, it doesn't have to be to even another person, but just like to yourself, acknowledging that, or if you're a higher power, acknowledging that. Being authentically yourself is a game changer. And I think there was a scientific study, and I don't remember the details of it, but the takeaway was that they found that authenticity was, I want to say, 10,000 times more influential energetically than the power of love, which I was blown away by, because up until, my late 30s, my mid to late 30s, I was convinced that love was the most powerful force in the world. And it is powerful. But learning authenticity was even more powerful, had me super curious. So that's what this past year has been about for me, and has been, I've been doubling down on that in my coaching, and just helping people feel comfortable being themselves 100%, and just getting rid of the criticisms and the narratives and all of that good stuff. Just disconnecting.
I need to find this study as well, because I do find like love, which is like also at the episode, like the center of our heart. I do find that like its vibration in itself is very strong. It's very healing and it's very powerful. So when you were saying like just the power of being authentic is even bigger, or even something like more powerful, is at first I was like, no, there's no way. But when you really think about it, you are literally the only person, like you are the only you. So that's gotta be something so extreme and so powerful. And yet, like even present day, like the folks that we're interacting with, they're not being true to themselves. They're not being authentic enough. And so I think the two intertwine, like learning like how to practice more self-care and self-love, and feeding yourself, the like we talked about food and not getting the gut stuck and stuff like that. But I do think the two intertwined is they can help feed into each other. I really do believe that.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. And I think that self-care and that self-pouring into, I think about it like this. I think about human beings as essentially walking, talking tuning forks, right? And we all have our note that is our ideal note, our signature, our energy signature. And then from that place, wrap it in love. Because love without authenticity, what is that? That's like sugar on a donut. You know what I mean? Like that feels nice for a minute, but it doesn't really get bone deep, right?
It's not real. It's not real. Like that's the perfect analogy. Like love needs to be, love is not sugar on a donut. Like that is so great.
In so many ways, it's not love. Physically and metaphorically.
Yeah, like think about it. In an instant, it sounds good, but then once you're done with it, you already like are miserable and you're like, why the hell did I just eat this? But you learned and you're willing to accept this, so that when love does, you start to cultivate more love. I always say, people are like, oh, I want more love. I was like, well, you need to be willing to give it. Give yourself love. Give the world love. And then everything is in both ways. But yeah, I'm gonna remember the donut. I love that.
Right? And I think that also it's also being authentic acts as almost its own protection, right? Because you're repelling the things that do not resonate with you just by mere existing in that energy, but you're also drawing in things that are in alignment, which means that when love shows up in any capacity, it's definitely going to be more impactful, a deeper connection, and a connection where you don't feel like you need to hide any part of yourself. And I think that is a huge problem in modern relationships, that can definitely show up as a sacral chakra blockage and develop into a solar plexus blockage and all on up, right? But the minute that you are in a fake interaction with something, meaning that you're just coming from surface love because love is right, but it's not really authentic because you don't actually love this thing, that's a slippery slope, right? But if you're coming from your own vibration and you're wrapping that in love, that is like Fort Knox, right? We are upgrading our security system at that point to ensure that fake love is not attracted to our beacon of love, if that makes sense.
I do think that makes perfect sense. And I'm really glad you shared that, because I think we can easily get distracted. Again, like I'm not gonna forget the donut. Like this is just as good as one of my other great guests. She said how the average human being needs like 8 hugs a day. And I was like, well, I gotta get on that. But
I know.
back to like the love part, like you're right though, because we can get so distracted by like the shiny mentalities, and like living in a materialistic world. Like, yes, it looks shiny, but the moment you have it, that's it. But it's not going to feed your soul. It's not going to nourish you. It's not going to, massage your body in ways that make you feel safe. Like, this is why we have to, allow these tests to happen. It's why we ask ourselves these hard questions, or ask these questions with your partners, your lovers, or any kind of other relationship. So it doesn't have to be strictly like a sexual relationship or personal. This could be a professional relationship as well. Like, learning to speak up for yourself and stand within your power when something doesn't feel right, or you're wanting to move up in the world is very important. Like, being authentic, brand. And I would say also, like, I have to add it, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, but I do think learning to be more authentic is an ongoing process. I don't think, like, we're always getting closer and closer, to like your authenticity and your, I would say future self even. Like, that's why we create mood boards or vision boards. I got mine in the background and it's on my laptop. I think we're always getting closer, but then as we get closer, we find more things to put into our perspective. Like, okay, now that I'm at this level, my next version of self is going to do this. So I need to start doing X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's absolutely a valid point, and something that we all need to remember in our journey to authenticity is you're never there. You might be there and should be there in this moment to moment, but we do evolve, should be evolving, at least if we're doing the work. And if we're doing the work, we can't fail, but we can't not evolve. But that is a process of constantly getting to know yourself and recognizing when you need to redefine who you are and what it means to be authentically you, because that will change, not just personally, internally, but it also shows up in dynamic changes in your relationship. And one of the things that came up as well while you were speaking is talking about the solar plexus and the sacral chakra, and their similarities. Consuming is something that came up for me, and consumerism and that distraction. One of the most common things that I've seen in my health coaching clients, particularly the ones that struggle with diabetes and digestive disorders like Crohn's, they tend to use food as a distraction, but it's to the point where it has cut them off from their intuition, because now it's a coping mechanism, not fuel, right? And so when we make that mindset shift from food is fuel, and sometimes that looks like a little bit of chocolate or ice cream to boost our mood, that is perfectly healthy. But ideally, we are consuming things for a particular reason, right? For energy, for satiation, to get us through our day. And I think the same in relationships as well. I think that there needs to be, or people would benefit from, an increased level of discernment in using their sacral energy, not just with their romantic relationships, but also in their familial relationships, their professional relationships. Because if you are so open and not necessarily tuned into the authenticity of who you are, now we've lost boundaries. Now we're kind of meandering, and our love is just kind of free flowing, which sounds nice, but we live in a 3D world, and we need walls to bump up against, so we know where we stand in space. And so I think that when it comes to consumption, remembering that we are worthy of and deserve high quality things that we consume that only are meant to propel us forward. That's not to say we'll never make a mistake, but it does significantly reduce our potential for getting into the wrong relationship, being bamboozled, or getting sick by just picking out, whatever foods feel good in that moment, just kind of mindlessly consuming, or not realizing why we're even consuming in the first place. So I think that that's a big key to authenticity, is that discernment of what we're taking in.
That was amazing, Cecilia. Thank you. I know we're getting close up on our time. If not, we might be over. So I really appreciate you staying with me. And before I let you go, for everyone listening who's like, okay, I think I want to, I don't think it's a think, it's more like, you can feel it. What are some of your favorite ways or even favorite micro adjustments that we can do to become closer, if not activate more of our authenticity?
Oh, that's a good one. I think the key to micro adjustments is tapping in on a daily basis. I had a client that came in the other day, and she was a very healthy girl by all measurements and all of that. She's very fit. She's happy. She's in a good, healthy relationship. But she was telling me how her pain kept moving, right? So first it was her hip, then it was her shoulder, and she was getting very frustrated by this. And one of the things that I told her was, one of the most important things we can do in the morning is to check in with our body and see, what does our body need? Our body is a biochemical vessel, right? It is a living, breathing organism, just like a plant. And you are going to have to make those adjustments. And so sitting with yourself first thing in the morning, I think, is a really powerful practice. Sometimes I will do my meditations in the bathtub with the lights off. So there's a bit of sensory deprivation there. And I think that sensory deprivation is one of the best things that we can do to develop intuition. And it doesn't even have to take long, right? One of the most important pieces I've ever learned about how the body works is it only takes 3 minutes. 3 minutes for the body to produce a hormone, for it to produce any kind of chemical reaction. So when people are saying like, oh, I don't have 20 minutes a day to meditate or an hour a day to journal or whatever the case may be, just remember you only need 3 minutes, and you can stack your habits. So a lot of those micro adjustments can be stacked in with other things. So have a few squats while you're brushing your teeth, things like that. Like do a few lunges while you're waiting for your coffee. And those micro adjustments will start to come a little more naturally when you're tapped into your intuition. Because one of the beautiful things about having a strong intuitive connection is the ability to flow with change and to be agile mentally and emotionally. So I would say first thing in the morning, doing a quick meditation or sitting in silence, whatever that looks like. They have guided information on YouTube. You can find your favorite teacher. And you can also sit in silence or prayer. Both work. And I do want to point out that there is a difference between prayer and meditation that I think is important to highlight here, because we can develop our intuition using both. But the difference between prayer and meditation is when you're praying, you are essentially sending out your requests. You are taking an action to receive something, whether it's an answer or a resolution, what have you. When you're in meditation, you are switching that to the polar opposite, and now you are in receptive mode. So whereas before we were asking and speaking, sorry, I don't know if that's messing my screen, but in that prayer we're asking, but in the meditation we are ready to receive. So I like having both practices. I like sprinkling that in first thing in the morning and also last thing at night. So those would be my starters, I think, for anyone interested in kind of fine tuning that aspect of themselves.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being on the podcast, Cecilia. I myself, I've practiced meditation for a very long time. And I think just sitting and allowing yourself those few extra minutes in the morning can make the biggest difference in your day. And I can tell, like, if I wake up and I don't have like even like those 3 to 5 minutes to myself, I'm like, you could be cranky or something like that. So I do appreciate sharing your expertise, and thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much for the time. I'm super excited. I'm super proud of your brand, and I'm really excited to see what you do with it. So yeah, I'd love to come back anytime you want to talk about anything. I agree. I could talk about this forever, and I love our interaction. Oh. All right, sweetie. Well, thank you so much. And we'll be in touch soon, yeah?
Yes. Sounds great. And then everyone else, thank you so much for tuning into another episode of Love and Lattes. I'll have Cecilia's information linked if you want to check out some of her specialties and upcoming workshops. And thanks again. We'll see you soon.